The February 2nd deadline when QMSR goes into effect is approaching fast. And there's a lot of discussion in our industry circle about readiness for QMSR, but there isn't a whole lot of talk about whether FDA is ready. Hi everyone, I'm Naveen Agarwal, and I want to welcome all of you to this special episode of the Let's Talk Risk podcast, where I'm super excited to welcome once again Steve Silverman to the show. Now, Steve is the best person to talk about this topic because he has deep expertise and insights about how the agency thinks and operates. He spent 13 years at the FDA at positions of leadership, including as the director of Office of Regulatory Compliance. Later, he was vice president at AdvaBen, the industry-leading trade association, which engages with the FDA to shape policy decisions. And lately, Steve has been writing on his Substack what the FDA about the latest happenings at the FDA in the current environment. So I can't wait to talk to Steve about FDA's readiness for QMSR. With that, Steve, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. First and foremost, apologies to your viewers. This is a business podcast, and I am dressed like I'm in survival mode, but it's legitimately cold where I am, and I decided to go with a sweater just so that I didn't fall unconscious during the course of our conversation.
No problem, Steve. This is a very casual platform, so we can be as comfortable as we need to be. Now, Steve, you have written many articles on your Substack, and we'll give a link to Steve's Substack in the show notes. Guys, please go check it out because he is sharing his opinion in a very candid and very informed way. And I think it'll be very insightful for all of you. So, Steve, you have written a lot about what's going on with the FDA. So let's start there. What is the current environment at the FDA in general and CDRH in particular?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Naveen. I want to fight my urge to run around like Chicken Little, screaming that the sky is falling, right? Which is an easy response given all of the chaos that's occurred at FDA and across government. And so what I will say is this. Definitely, 2025 has been a year of extreme disruption at FDA, and it has damaged the agency in various respects, not the least of which is that there's been a significant reduction in the agency workforce throughout the agency, including at the device center. That includes a loss of expertise that I think will be difficult to repair over time. So it's not just moving people out of the agency, it's moving people out of the agency who have, in some cases, decades of very specialized experience. I also think it's very discouraging, some of the actions that have occurred at the agency level in terms of positions that have been taken by agency leaders that I would characterize as non-scientific, that are very politically and policy driven, that I don't think reflect the agency's traditional values and emphasis on medical judgment and objectivity. That being said, there are a lot of good people who remain at FDA who are doing important work. Are a lot of professionals who do very deeply understand the products that they are responsible for regulating, and they continue to show up day to day to do the best job that they can to make sure that products continue to be safe and effective.
So with this backdrop, whatever is happening at the agency, of course, it's a little bit of chaos, but you also mentioned that there are many good people still out there. So let's get one thing straight out of the way. I know a lot of people might be thinking that let's just wait it out. Hopefully we get a grace period. Hopefully this happens the same way that happened to MDR, where the timelines, the deadlines continue to get postponed. Let's get it out of the way. What is your view whether this is going to happen on February 2nd or not?
So if we are talking specifically about the launch, I shouldn't even say launch, I should say the activation of the QMSR framework on February 2nd, 2026, which is the plan. For reasons that we can discuss, Naveen, I fully believe that that activation is going to take place, notwithstanding the disruption that has occurred at FDA that I've described several moments ago. It's going to occur, and companies need to be ready for it. As a general matter, I think that it's disadvantageous for companies to simply sit back and watch events at FDA and hope that their operations are not disrupted. I think that that is a particularly disadvantageous policy here with respect to the launch of the QMSR. That approach will fail.
Yeah. So the bottom line is, don't count on luck. It is going to happen. Be ready, be prepared. Now, how it gets rolled out and how it affects individual manufacturers remains to be seen, because we know, Steve, that FDA has not published the updated QSIT guidance. So we don't know what approach they will take, but it's enough for us to understand that it is happening. Now, Steve, I think on paper, and I know FDA has tried to play this also in the public domain, that on paper it is a not a big change. Under QSR, also FDA expected this kind of risk-based response from the manufacturers for quality management system. And even in the submission space, on paper it looks kind of simple, but I've been talking about it on my Substack that at the leadership level, I think we should think about long-term perspective about where FDA could go with this. So I want to ask you, if you look back on your experience, can you think of any kind of similar changes that FDA went through or CDRH went through, which they had to implement and roll out over a period of time? Can you think of any parallels and share that story with us? What happened at that time?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Naveen. One thing that comes to mind is the introduction of the Medical Device Single Audit Program, or MDSAP. So, for those of your listeners who may be unfamiliar with MDSAP, it is a program where FDA, along with representatives of other jurisdictions like Health Canada, like Australia, like Brazil, they follow a regulatory framework whereby one single audit that is conducted for MDSAP actually serves multiple regulators. And so the pain point that was trying to be solved by MDSAP was companies saying, look, it's really disruptive for us to operate day to day when on any given day of the week or any given week, we may have multiple regulators with similar but not identical regulatory frameworks that we need to present evidence against, et cetera, et cetera. And so MDSAP was stood up as a program to help try to address that concern. And as I mentioned, the core of the program is it's one audit that serves multiple regulators. So it decreases the number of regulators on site, and it decreases the number of parallel regulatory frameworks that firms need to be prepared for. So I was present at FDA while MDSAP was being developed, piloted, refined, and I think the parallel that strikes me as it relates to the introduction of the QMSR is that there was a lot of planning and deliberation that went into the development of MDSAP. There were many rounds of iteration. There were lots of opportunities for stakeholders to provide feedback and to help inform the development of the MDSAP program that exists today. I think that the same points in many respects can be made with respect to the QMSR. So one thing that is curious about the QMSR is that by the time it was launched in February of 2024, right, it had been an initiative that was a priority and that had been underway since, I want to say, early 2019. So it was a long-standing initiative, and it was delayed for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was the COVID pandemic. One consequence was that this extra time gave the agency a lot of time to think about and to refine the QMSR initiative over time. And I think that the agency took advantage of that opportunity. In addition, after consulting with stakeholders, FDA published a statement in 2024 saying, look, we understand that stakeholders want extra time to transform their processes to comply with this new regulatory framework. We, FDA, on our part, can use this time also to manage regulatory changes that we need to put in place to be ready. And so, yes, the QMSR as of February 2024 is operational. However, we are not going to begin inspecting firms against it until February of 2026. And you, Ready Community, use this intervening gap period to get ready. Well, it is nearly February 2026, and it's going to happen.
It's going to happen. So funny that you mentioned MDSAP, and obviously it was a significant change, and many firms took advantage of that and streamlined their regulatory operations. Let's peel the onion a little bit more from the FDA's point of view. When something like that happens, you mentioned that they do a lot of planning and conversations with stakeholders, refinement. But as the deadline approaches, walk us through what happens within the agency.
My view of the agency today, no surprise, is not as transparent as it was when I was with the agency roughly a decade ago. But I have talked to people in the regulated space, including some people who work at FDA, enough so that I can confidently say, yeah, I have a pretty good view as to what's happening at the agency. And so I think the best way to answer your question is to be a bit specific. For example, there are myriad internal policy documents, guidance documents, publications, etc., that make reference to the QSR, the quality system regulation. All of those documents need to be amended so that that reference is replaced with the phrase QMSR. If that has not already occurred, I'm confident that it will be done in time for the QMSR rollout. In addition, as many of your listeners know, FDA relies on a very active and robust field force. Used to be ORA, and now it is, I believe, OPP. And individuals who are going to be conducting inspections as part of that field force need to be trained about what it is that they are looking for, how what they are looking for relates to what they looked at historically, how they need to report deviations, necessary terminology, additional things that FDA actually wants them to look for that may not be captured within the QMSR framework. So, for example, FDA has distinct recall and adverse event reporting requirements. And although FDA has said, yes, we are transitioning our quality system oversight to the QMSR model, the agency is going to continue holding firms accountable for adverse event reporting and recall requirements. And so firms need to be aware that those topics are on the menu for review during inspection, and that FDA regulators are being instructed how to check for those issues at the same time as they are looking for QMSR compliance.
Yeah, that's awesome though. And in fact, I do want to confirm what you just mentioned. I believe I read recently that FDA has published in the Federal Register that they have updated many of the policy documents where QSR was being referenced and QMSR will be referenced. So they are moving ahead. Absolutely, that's another signal that they are moving ahead. And I've also heard that they have done a lot of training for the internal staff. The wild card though is that they have not published the updated QSIT guidance. And I don't know what is happening with that. We'll keep an eye on that and talk about it on Let's Talk Risk as we become more familiar with that.
I think that's right, Naveen. I also know, so again, for your listeners, QSIT, QSIT, it's an acronym that stood for the inspection framework that FDA would follow to verify compliance with FDA's quality system requirements. And so in transitioning to the QMSR, one question is, okay, what's the update going to be for QSIT because it can't continue to apply? Now, you actually may know the answer to this. The recollection is that FDA said that it is not going to explicitly publish a new inspection framework like QSIT adapted for QMSR, but that's not going to be an impediment to inspecting firms using the QMSR framework. Whether that's changed, whether that's only part of the picture, I'm not sure, but you and your listeners may actually have a much more clear picture.
We'll keep an eye on that and we'll follow up later on in other conversations. To some extent, I think what you are saying makes a lot of sense to me because reading warning letters from a distance and understanding how FDA views the quality system and how they interpret the deficiencies in the context of quality system, I can see that they do have a good understanding of what it means to apply the 13485 principles. I have seen that. So I don't believe it will be a very big lift for many of their inspectors to go in and start inspecting the QMSR. They might have to rely on, some automation or some other referencing to give the explicit citation numbers versus the QSR number. But I think their methodology is unlikely to change and their focus is unlikely to change because they're still going to focus on design controls, on CAPA, on supplier controls, the big items where we are continuing to be deficient, in my view, in the industry. So I think you are right. I don't think it'll be that big a deal. Even if they publish an updated QSIT, I don't think it'll look too different. So let's talk about MDSAP a little bit because
Right.
many people, I think, in the industry might be thinking, oh, we are MDSAP certified. We don't really have to worry too much about FDA's QMSR inspection. I don't believe that to be the case, but I want to ask you, what is your view?
The answer to your question, Naveen, is no. The FDA has said explicitly that it will not rely on MDSAP certification as proof of compliance with the QMSR. It is the case that the QMSR relies heavily on ISO 13485, which
Mhm.
also underpins MDSAP. So,
Mm.
firms that are MDSAP compliant today will have an even easier time demonstrating compliance with the QMSR. But the QMSR and ISO 13485, and unless firms are aware of and make accommodations for the differences between the two regulatory frameworks, they are at risk of being cited by FDA for failing to comply with the QMSR, even if they have been MDSAP certified.
And I think my understanding was that FDA does not directly do the MDSAP audits. These are independent third parties which are accredited by the FDA. However, the inspection will be done by FDA's investigators. That's correct, right?
The inspections will be done by FDA investigators. So this is my understanding of what the state of play will be on February 3rd, 2026. Naveen. So first, the most straightforward dynamic involves firms that are simply being inspected by FDA. Let's assume that there is a firm that is not an MDSAP participant, right? And FDA shows up on February 3rd, 2026 to conduct an inspection. That firm will be inspected, not audited, and it will be inspected according to the QMSR criteria. Now, inherent in the MDSAP program is that firms that are MDSAP participants are audited on a regular basis by MDSAP representatives, authorized auditors, for example. And the FDA, under some circumstances, is willing to accept those audit reports from the MDSAP auditors in place of an FDA inspection. It is my understanding that that process will continue post February 3rd, 2026, right? However, being an MDSAP participant does not guarantee a firm that FDA will not show up at some point to conduct an inspection according to FDA's regulatory criteria. And there are a number of FDA inspection types, such as for cause or directed inspections, that justify FDA investigators showing up regardless of whether a firm is an MDSAP participant.
That is a great perspective, Steve. Thank you for sharing that with us. Bottom line is that if you are participating in MDSAP and you are being audited, chances are low that you will have an FDA inspection if there is no kind of obvious risk based on what your adverse event data is telling or what FDA has other information about. But if you are not, the next inspection might be from the FDA under QMSR context. So this is very important for us to understand.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, which is just to say, I mean, FDA does see audit reports. If an audit report is negative, the FDA may decide, in addition to all the other reasons, to inspect, in which case FDA is going to inspect against its own regulatory framework, in this case, the QMSR, and that is a risk for firms. I think, Naveen, one interesting point is just to take a step back and say, look, as a practical matter, what's going to happen in February of 2026? If a firm has made good faith efforts to transition to satisfy the QMSR framework, and it hasn't done a perfect job, is it the case that FDA is going to be waiting with bated breath to slap the firm firm with a warning letter or to otherwise penalize it for failing to satisfy its regulatory requirements? I think the answer is almost certainly no. There is no formal quote unquote grace period following early February for firms to comply. But I think as a practical matter, if an FDA investigator walks into a firm and finds that the firm has actively worked to transition its quality practices so that the firm understands and that it satisfies FDA's quality management system regulation requirements, even if the firm's performance in that regard is in some ways imperfect, my very, very strong suspicion is that the FDA will give firms grace. And I hope that the dynamic in those scenarios will be FDA acting much more as an instructor, a teacher, to help firms be effective and compliant over time, not a cop on the beat writing tickets, right?
That makes a lot of sense to me.
Right.
And I think this is why I think QARA leaders should have some reflection internally to gauge their level of exposure and risk when it comes to this transition. And not everyone will be in the same boat. It's not like the sky is falling for a lot of people. It's not. We really need to kind of take a step back and evaluate our own risk. And that is what I keep talking about in the context of your overall data in the real world. In the context of your post-market data, your safety and effectiveness performance, you know more than anybody else, even better than FDA. I think QARA leaders probably know already where the vulnerabilities and blind spots are. So I think that would be.
I think that that's true. I think that an additional interesting question is, okay, what to do if a firm is really not in place to meet the QMSR as of February 2nd of next year, really hasn't done the groundwork that it should have done in order to prepare for that transition and to be ready to be evaluated by FDA, for example. And under those circumstances, I believe that there's more of a game plan than simply duck and hope for the best when the bombs start falling. I think even in that situation, firms can mitigate somewhat the adverse effects by being able to tell FDA or any other regulator a cogent, thoughtful story about why certain changes haven't occurred so far, when the changes will be complete, and in the interim, what the firm is doing to assure that its products are safe and that if any safety signals emerge, the firms are ready to act on the signals in a timely and responsible way.
Absolutely. For everybody, I'm going to share a very important practical tool, and it's called a quality plan. I think it is very important for firms to establish a quality plan, and it might be, basic and simple. It doesn't have to be complex and 100-page document. It can be simple, but to your point, I think that allows firms to give that story to the FDA in a proper way and not say, we haven't really thought about it or we are working on it and here's the plan. But if you have a quality plan already in place and you're working on it, I do believe if there are no serious issues which are supported by adverse events data, I do believe, like you said, I think FDA is going to be very cooperative, very collaborative with firms in making sure they reach a level of maturity over time. That's what I'm reading. And I think that's what I'm hearing that from you as well.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So Steve, I know you hear a lot of people from your circle. What are you hearing in terms of the top concerns at this point of time that people still have about this transition?
Honestly, Naveen, I am not hearing a high level of concern about this transition specifically. What I am hearing is, given the significant regulatory events over the last year, given the significant reduction in personnel within the agency and other guardrails that have been put in place, is the agency sufficiently well staffed, knowledgeable, and empowered to execute under this new framework? I believe that we'll see how well the agency does. And I also believe that the agencies, let me rephrase, I know that the agency's performance will be negatively affected by the things that have happened over the past year. And then the only question is how significant that damage is.
Now, one last point I want to discuss with you, Steve, is what I believe FDA is signaling to us, their perspective on this QMSR transition through a guidance that they have just released. And we don't need to go into too much detail, but they have released a draft guidance for the information they require in pre-market submission of PMAs. And if you read that guidance, it basically repeats everything that 1345 says. If you count the number of times they have the word risk in there, it's close to 40 times. So they're already signaling that if a sponsor comes to FDA with a new PMA application, we would expect a QMSR compliant, effective quality management system in place. And we would go check that out as part of our pre-approval inspection, and we will expect this information in the submission. So it tells me a couple of things that I think FDA is trying to emphasize where it matters the most in pre-market submissions, that at least those companies should get it right as soon as possible. But it's also sending a signal to the rest of the industry that even though we are talking about PMA, if you come to us with a new 510K submission, our expectations are not going to change. And in post-market, we are going to be even more rigorous, especially if we have reason to believe that you have not been particularly disciplined and careful about following up on your exposure and risk in the marketplace. Am I reading it the right way, or is it too much reading into it? Or what is your perspective on this overall, what they are trying to signal to us?
It would be, in my view, impossible to argue that the QMSR hasn't been specifically developed and socialized by FDA to show greater explicit sensitivity to risk. And so what I really liked about your comments is that in addition to the basic quality requirements that apply to devices that applied prior to the QMSR and that will apply in the future, the QMSR supports the introduction of risk as an explicit consideration and focal point for products when they are being evaluated pre-market and while they are already on the market. As many, many other smart commentators have noted, the current quality system regulatory framework already accommodates and reflects risk, although very sparsely in terms of explicitly referencing it as part of a regulatory scheme. I think that the QMSR aggressively works to close that gap. And in the same way that I would characterize it as near malpractice for any regulatory professional not to be ready for the QMSR transition, I think it is near malpractice not to be able to have a smart conversation about product risk throughout the product lifecycle.
And being able to measure that and monitor that is very, very important. So it should be working. It should be effective.
Yes.
Steve, what a fascinating conversation we have had already. As we close, I want to invite you by sharing your thoughts on what should leaders in the QARA space do right now. Let's say they get into the elevator with their CEO and the CEO asks, hey, how are things going with this, what I hear about QMSR? How do you think they should respond?
For me, Naveen, the most effective communication strategy for discussions with business professionals, including C-suite leads, is to be able to characterize the work that's being done in terms that will land, be understood by, and be supported by those business leads. So the conversation is never simply, we are undertaking regulatory work because that's what the regulators require. Rather, it's to say, we are undertaking this work because there are risks to the business, lost customers, cost, lost market share from failing to comply. And the outcome of this work will be products that are potentially better quality, but certainly better marketable so that we have ability to gain share in the marketplace. And that serves the business. That's a different type of conversation, and the ability of quality professionals to translate their work to align with business objectives is, I think, an ability that defines successful quality professionals.
And I know you and I have talked about this in the past, and we'll give a link to our podcast about this strategic positioning and conversation about our regulatory work in the show notes below. Steve, I don't want to close our conversation without asking you to tell us a little bit more about your Substack, what you're doing with your Substack, and where do you want to take it?
So, Naveen, I'm very, very happy to have that discussion. I can't have the discussion without talking about your role, which is to say, and I'm just sharing with all of your readers, the reason that I have a Substack is because for more than a year, you very patiently and actively encouraged me to change my habit, which was to write something, find a conventional outlet to publish it, and share it around, to just using Substack and to put something out on a regular basis. If it used to be quarterly, it's now weekly. Essentially, what I am trying to do is to find topics of interest to medical device firms that relate to the way that FDA is regulating devices and talk through what are the implications of those topics for device firms. What does it mean that they can do and not do that is the same or different than what they've done historically? It is, I think, very, very straightforward, which is to say, if the insights are useful to people, fantastic. If they are not really individuals' cup of tea, or they are off topic from what the individuals are interested in, also fine. Perhaps most importantly, my Substack is free. So there is very little transactional risk in those of you who are interested in checking it out.
What I would say to everybody who's listening and has not seen Steve's Substack, please go check it out. Because what I love about your writing is that you go beyond the headlines in a way which is honest and candid and sharp, but you don't leave it there. You actually discuss the impact on medtech firms and offer concrete advice and tips to leaders in medtech about what they can do.
Yeah, thank you, Naveen. I think that to some degree, I've been able to work against my own bad tendencies, which are to look around at the things that have been happening and to complain about the state of affairs and go a bit further when I'm offering the most value and to say, okay, yes, things are damaged and in some cases broken. Now, what do we do? And I think that the interesting conversation really revolves around now, what do we do? The ability to point out problems that exist is not particularly valuable and it's not insightful.
Yeah. So I love that, Steve. I wish you all the best. Please keep doing what you're doing. And I love your voice. I hope more people will discover that. And we'll give a link to that Substack in the show notes below.
Thank you.
Steve, thank you so much for coming to the show again and sharing your wonderful insights. I appreciate it. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you all very much.